Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. Amateur Traveler, episode 175. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about Red Square, Lenin's tomb, and miniskirts as we go to Moscow in Russia. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into today's interview, I do have a couple news stories for you. Let's start with the bad news story, because I think maybe you're a bad news first kind of crowd. There were 30 people injured and 2 seriously when a Northwest flight hit turbulence. This was back on February 20th. And I just bring up this story because it's a reminder that when you're on a flight, they do tell you for your safety to keep your seatbelt buckled while you're in your seat, and this is the reason why. The second story is a good news story, and JetBlue is doing something very nice. What they're trying to do is they're trying to make it so that you are not afraid to book your flights. But some people are afraid that they're going to be laid off, and therefore they're not booking their flights. What JetBlue is going to do under a new program is for people who book flights between February 1st and June 1st, 2009, and lose their job on or after February 17th, they may be eligible for a refund. So what they're trying to do is make you not afraid to travel. Good idea, JetBlue. Links to both of those stories, as well as several other news items, can be found at the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome to the show John, who's coming to us from Dallas. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris.
Now, you've actually been to over 100 countries, although today we're going to talk about one in particular, and we're going to talk about Russia, and more particularly Moscow. But first, 100 countries, and you're how old?
26. That's pretty amazing, isn't it?
Before we started recording the show, John was talking about using some of the advantages of working in the travel industry, of celebrating a New Year's celebration in Tokyo and then yet again in Dublin on the same evening, the next day, however that would be counted. So,
right.
So why Moscow? You've been there numerous times.
I have. I've always been attracted to Russia, especially to the politics and government of Russia. College, I studied political science and then somehow ended up in the travel industry. But Moscow in particular, as being the modern-day capital of Russia, has always interested me. Going and seeing the power of the Kremlin and going and standing in Red Square where tanks roll down the cobblestone streets is just an amazing thing to think back and imagine the history of what people have seen and gone through there, and the economic and political strife that the Russians and the former Soviets have gone through. It's a fascinating place to visit, especially for someone who's interested kind of in that political or historic background, and there's definitely a lot of interesting things to see there.
And how many times have you been?
This was my third trip to Moscow, my fourth trip to Russia. I had previously visited St. Petersburg on my first trip to Russia.
And the first time you went there, what was the biggest surprise?
The biggest surprise was how the Russian people are very welcoming. If you walk down the street in Russia, a lot of people are walking kind of with their heads down, with not a smile on their face, and they don't look very friendly. But it's the exact opposite of that is true. The people there are very warm, very welcoming, very friendly. And even though it's somewhat rare to run into someone, especially when you get outside of the cities that speaks English, you can kind of communicate with hand signals with them, and they love the fact that you're trying to communicate with them. But, knowing a little bit of Russian has definitely helped to get around there.
And how much do you know?
I know about 2 words in Russia, which is thank you and subway. So those 2 came in very handy. You would say spasiba or spasibo, which is my butchered English pronunciation of thank you.
Spasiba.
Spasiba, yes.
Yeah. Я понимаю по-русски не очень хорошо. I don't speak Russian very well. That's all I know.
No. And what's interesting is, especially if you go into the train stations of Moscow, you always kind of seek out a younger person because the younger college-age type folks, they are learning, or a lot of them have learned some English. But even those that would be considered somewhat conversational English there will tell you they don't know English because they're a little embarrassed. They seem to be a little shy or a little afraid that you won't think they speak English well enough, and they will just say they don't speak English.
Yeah, and I've run into that in many countries until they hear my butchered version of their language, in which case they feel better about their English generally. But
Right, absolutely. And the funniest thing is I went with a friend of mine the last time to Moscow a couple of months ago, back in October, and we're both young men, and we would be standing in line somewhere, and we would be speaking in English to each other, and there would just be this crowd of young Russian girls surrounding us, just giggling and laughing, listening to us speak English. And that was kind of a funny thing to see that. I've never seen that anywhere else.
Well, that must have been just awful.
Russian women are some of the most beautiful women in the world. I don't see how they can walk around the streets of Moscow in the winter with these high-heeled boots on cobblestone streets and miniskirts. It still to this day amazes me.
If you had a week to spend in Moscow, what would you recommend somebody do?
Definitely spend a week in Moscow. The trips that I've taken have all been short. They've all been a few days each. Moscow is very easy to get around. Their subway system is probably, if not the most efficient, probably behind the tube in London. It is right up there. It's extremely efficient. Trains run all the time. There's a ring that runs around the center of the city, a circle line, and then the lines that come off of it, kind of like a spider. They are extremely efficient, and the stations are just ornate and beautiful. You go back to some of them that have just these beautiful murals and mosaics and ornate chandeliers, and even some that still have sickles and hammers in the plaster and the concrete inside the stations. But if you're going to spend a week in Moscow, you definitely have to start off with the main tourist sites, which, of course, is Red Square. In Red Square is Saint Basil's Cathedral, which is a beautifully ornate, colorful, onion bulb domed church that was originally commissioned by Ivan the Terrible to be built. And next to that, of course, sits the red walls of the Kremlin, and inside of that are all of the government buildings and some other institutional buildings, and then the Museum of History sits outside of that. That's definitely the first place you have to go if you're going to be in Moscow for a week. It's just standing there looking up and seeing these things. And probably for folks a little older than me will remember watching on television the tanks rolling down those cobblestone streets towards the cathedral.
Right.
One thing that I think to make sure that people don't miss is modern-day Moscow. And modern-day Moscow is full of all of the Western shopping and stores that you would normally see, but also some very interesting Russian stores. There's actually a huge mall in Red Square, the State Universal Store. One time it housed some of the offices of the Stalin era, and now it's this huge, beautiful department store that has Russian and Western, even American stores. So definitely Red Square is the place to go. There are other just absolutely beautiful cathedrals, shopping, fantastic sights, things that folks will probably remember seeing from those times when Americans were not going to Moscow. It's kind of a mysterious place still even this day. There's a beautiful arch called the Triumphal Arch, which is dedicated to the Russian victory over Napoleon's army, which in terms of beauty, I think, rivals the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. It's gorgeous. Then there's these huge Stalin skyscrapers all over Moscow. And I actually had the opportunity to stay in one. I stayed at the Hilton, which is actually in one of these old Soviet Stalin-esque skyscrapers. I've never stayed in a hotel that has a huge sickle and hammer on the top of it. I guess there's the first time for everything. One thing else that I think is very important to mention is don't take for granted some things in Moscow you maybe look at seeing online and not go to. For example, the Moscow Zoo is, I think, probably the best zoo I've ever visited in the world, and I've been to some great zoos, San Diego and in Chicago and such, but the Moscow Zoo is just fantastic. It's unbelievable. And they have a lot of really interesting Siberian-type animals there that you probably will only see in Moscow.
Okay, interesting. Are there things that the tourists normally go to that just kind of left you cold, or depending on what time of year you went, you might have been left cold a lot of times, but...
Right. For some reason, always ended up going in the middle of winter or the beginning of winter, the coldest part of the year in Moscow. I need to go back in the summertime when it's a little warmer. One thing that I was a little disappointed with was the Pushkin Museum of Fine Arts, which is kind of one of those institutional type things in Russia. The Pushkin Museum and also the State Historical Museum in Red Square left a lot to be desired. A lot of it was more of an earlier era of Russia. All of the signs were only in Russian. There was nothing in English explaining what anything was. Those were some things that left a lot to be desired in terms of I didn't know really what I was looking at. And I was really interested in learning more kind of about the Soviet and the Cold War era in Russia. And it seems like, especially for the Cold War era, they've kind of erased that from their history. And in fact, there's a museum dedicated to the Cold War in Moscow, which you have to actually go to and be invited by a Russian to attend.
Interesting.
So I have not had the opportunity to go see that museum yet, but definitely the State Historical Museum and the Pushkin Museum, I think if you have the time, definitely go, but they shouldn't be at the top of your list.
Okay. And being a student of Russian history, did you go to Lenin's tomb? Did you do some of the typical tourist things?
Of course, Lenin's mausoleum, and one thing I think is important to mention is that there's a lot of talk, especially amongst the politicians in Russia, of going ahead and giving him a formal burial and closing that mausoleum. And it's something definitely if you're going to go in the next couple of months, couple of years, you definitely want to go see because it might not be there much longer.
My understanding is it's still very popular.
It's extremely popular. In fact, we waited in line several hours to get into it. It was very, very popular. And around the Kremlin, you have the burial sites of several other of the well-known former Russian leaders, such as Stalin and Brezhnev and some others. But definitely the Lenin's mausoleum is definitely the highlight of seeing kind of that Russian political history.
On the other side, did you discover something that the tourists usually don't go to that you thought was a real find?
That's funny because my friend and I, when we had went the last time, were sitting back in our hotel room around 9 o'clock at night on a Friday, and we said, we want to go out and do what normal 20-something Russians do on a Friday night. So we leave our hotel, left 9 o'clock, and we're walking through a district where there's all these clubs and bars, and there's nothing there. There's no one out. They're closed. And we realized that most of them don't open until very, very late at night or early in the morning.
Okay.
Another thing that I like to do when I travel is I like to go to local grocery stores and pick up spices and candy and things you might not necessarily find back at home. And there was a grocery store across from our hotel, that you could buy a bottle of Russian vodka for about $4. You could buy Russian candies, Russian spices, anything you would want of Russian nature caviar, just cheap caviar. And we would go back to our hotel and listen to bad 80s Russian pop music, drinking vodka and eating caviar. So that was a lot of fun.
And when you talk about eating, obviously, caviar, borscht, there's a few things that Russians are known for. What is the restaurant scene really like in Moscow right now? Because I know that's changed quite a lot.
It has. Moscow has always been mentioned as one of the, if not the most expensive city in the world.
Right.
And it depends on what you're going out and looking for. I prefer personally to stay at nicer hotels and eat at nicer restaurants, but I also like to go out and experience the street food and go to the grocery store and meal myself in my hotel room. Moscow is what you make of it in terms of money. Yes, you can go and spend $200 or $300 on a meal of beluga caviar and expensive. I know.
No, I don't think I can.
But you can also go and on the street and eat Russian hot dogs, which are just fantastic. And it has an all-encompassing bun. They actually shove the hot dog right down into the bun with this mustard cheese sauce, which is really interesting. And there's these little stands all over Moscow that sell these hot dogs and then Russian beer. Those I found very interesting, very good, and very cheap. And it seemed to be a lot of what the locals were eating. And that's what we would do, is we would go and find what the locals were eating. I do have to mention, though, in one section of Moscow, which is a very well-known touristy shopping area of Moscow, which is called Arbat Street, which runs basically several blocks almost all the way to Red Square. I did have probably what I would imagine would be the best hamburger I've ever had. I'm pretty sure it was beef. It was very good, so that was kind of interesting.
Now, as you started talking about street names and such, you mentioned earlier that you had a little trouble with your Russian pronunciation.
I still do. It's a different alphabet. Some of the letters are the same as the Latin and the English letters, but they have different pronunciations.
Sure.
A lot of the street names, the subway station names, have very similar sounding, very similar looking names. And in fact, my friend and I found ourselves on the subway saying, okay, we get off at S, backwards R, lowercase b, the thing that looks like an O station. Now, unfortunately, there were 3 or 4 stations with the exact same name or very similar spelling. So we ended up once at an area outside of Moscow, which was near a nuclear power plant and kind of an unsavory neighborhood when we should have been heading towards our nice hotel.
What's one warning you would give about going to Moscow?
I think don't go with any preconditions or with any pre-thoughts of what to expect. Every time I go back to Russia, I am just amazed at going and having watched all of the Lonely Planet videos and read all of the guidebooks on Russia and Moscow in particular. I'm always amazed every time I go that I just find something exciting. So I think if you go with a strict itinerary written down, or if you go with a tour group, I don't think you're going to find as much out of Moscow and out of Russia as if you go independently and kind of find your way around and figure things out for your own.
We haven't talked anything about the arts other than some of the museums. We had a chance to experience the ballet, for instance, which was fairly well known, I would have to say.
You know, one thing that I have seen before when I went a couple of years ago was the opera in Moscow, which was just fantastic. Okay. It was amazing. You know, and I'm not an opera type person really, but I would go back again just because it was fantastic. Moscow also has a fantastic theater scene. You're going to see a lot of Western shows in Moscow. Mamma Mia, for example, of course, is huge in Moscow right now.
Okay.
There's been some information in the news about Vladimir Putin getting a private performance of Mamma Mia. But Mamma Mia is huge right now in Russia. You'll see some other Western shows in Moscow. In fact, we saw Jubilee. We saw some advertising for Oklahoma. Some other off-Broadway type productions. But the theater scene, the music scene, there's a huge kind of up-and-coming underground Russian punk music scene, which is not necessarily my cup of tea, but I find it very interesting that you'd see a lot of these, what would look like, you know, Sex Pistols type 1970s, The Clash groupies hanging out and just strumming and playing some punk music on the street corners. That's a kind of a good overview of the art scene in Moscow. Everywhere you go around Moscow, inside and outside, there are huge ornate mosaics. And I'd mentioned earlier that some of the subway stations, there are huge mosaics of Lenin and some of the leaders of Russia and of the Soviet symbols and things like that. And that's Going through the subway stations is like going through an art gallery.
Interesting. What do you wish you'd known?
I wish I had known Russian. I wish I had known some Russian and was able to communicate more with the locals. I really find when traveling, communicating with the locals really opens your eyes up and your ears up to a lot of different things, and it can stimulate all of the senses in terms of finding out their view of their city. Everywhere I've traveled, they've always wanted to know what it's like in the United States if they haven't been there before. Is it like they see on TV in Hollywood? Is everyone a celebrity? Those sort of things. And you get those questions from the little bit of communication you can make with folks in Russia. But I wish I would have known Russian and was able to communicate more with the locals. And I wish I would have known not to go in the wintertime.
Now, as a student of Russian history, I would have thought the second one you would have had some inkling of.
Yeah, well, next time I'm going to go in July.
You say you didn't have that many times when you could communicate with people. Who is the most memorable person you met there?
The most memorable person I met in Moscow? That is a great question. This is going to sound kind of strange. The last time I was in Moscow, in the subway station, I had a laminated color map of the Moscow subway stations. And one thing is take a map of the subway stations before you go, because most of the stations don't have maps they hand out like they do in the U.S. cities or in London. So take a copy of the subway map with you. If you're going in winter, laminate it so it doesn't get snow and rain on it. But we went up to a young, beautiful Russian girl and was asking her how to get to our subway station. And she basically took our hands, my friend and I, she took our hands and dragged us across the station to the correct line we were supposed to be on. And there was no English involved, just pointing. She hugged us before we left, and we thought that was very interesting. That was probably the most memorable person I met in Russia. It was the most time I ever spent with someone in Russia.
Interesting.
And just the kindness that they showed in helping out two kind of befuddled American tourists who didn't know what they were talking about.
Best day you had in Moscow?
Best day I've had in Moscow is always the day that I arrive in Moscow, because it's something completely different, yet something very familiar. You see a lot of the same things you would see in Western American cities. You see a lot of poverty. You see a lot of wealth. And you see a lot of hustle and bustle throughout the city. But it's always an exciting moment for me the day that I always arrive in Moscow, because in some weird way I always feel I'm at home. It's probably one of the few cities in the world that I would actually rather live in than visit. And that's because for some reason I feel as though I'm at home there. Even though I'm unable to communicate in the language or read the signs or know where I'm going, it's always a wonderful place. So my best day in Moscow is always the day I arrive, and the worst day is always the day I leave.
What about Moscow is familiar? Moscow and Dallas, I don't think, those cities are just so similar. So
they're not. It's hard to find a good honky-tonk in Moscow.
That's what I was thinking.
I equate it more to a lot of the travel I've done around the United States, having lived in Toronto, having lived in the St. Louis area, and having lived in the Boston area. It's very similar in terms of what you see in the actual cities. You see people moving about, you see people going to work, coming home from work, going shopping, taking their kids out. And people watching in Moscow is something that I think is a must-do and a must experience.
Yeah, you mentioned the miniskirts already.
The miniskirts and the high-heeled boots on the cobblestone streets. But just watching the old Russian babushkas, the grandmothers, with their carts and their scarves over their heads, milling about through the streets coming home from the market, that's something that's very interesting that you might not see every day in a U.S. city. But if you can manage your way around New York or Boston or L.A., you can manage your way around Moscow.
Okay.
Even with the winter barrier.
On the flip side, the moment in Moscow you felt the furthest away from home?
The moment I felt the furthest away from home was probably standing inside of Lenin's mausoleum, because it's something you really wouldn't see in the United States. And you're sitting there and you're looking at this former leader of Russia that everyone has read about in their history books and everyone has learned about, and how the people of Russia have a completely different idea of who he was versus what we understand him to be. The same goes with the Cold War, standing in Red Square and seeing the lines still painted on the cobblestone streets from where they had the parades of tanks during their victory celebrations, and realizing that their view of the Cold War is completely different than what our view of the Cold War was.
Mm-hmm.
I think standing there and just soaking in the history, you really feel as though this is a country that 30 years ago was an enemy of the United States, according to us. But thinking, were we an enemy to them, is something that's very interesting, I think.
And have you done any tours or other things that have helped you get a more insight into that gulf of understanding?
I haven't. I'm very much against tours, and I kind of like to be a little independent and do my own thing. I read the guidebooks and I do those sort of things, but I also like to, before I take a major trip like this, reach out to people who are actually living in Russia. So going on to the internet, finding resources of where you can actually speak with and talk with Russians, find out what they would do if they were visiting their city, what they would do on an average day in their city, and kind of going along that path rather than doing any sort of a tour. Most of what I've understand and know about Russia I learned from textbooks and from university and from speaking with friends who have traveled there and from also knowing some folks that have lived in Russia and know Russian.
And you mentioned going online. Any particular websites that have been a good resource for you?
I'm a big fan of wikitravel.org.
Okay, sure. Mm-hmm.
It's the Wikipedia of travel. I find that to be very useful. I think one thing that's important to mention is the process of getting a visa to Russia is extremely difficult and time-consuming and costly. And relying upon a visa processor on the internet, I think, is very, very important. If you go at it alone through the embassy or through the consulate, it's a very timely, costly procedure. I use the website called visahq.com. I recommend them. There's several other visa processors out there. Just Google Russia visa. Make sure it's somebody that's reliable and reputable. Will guide you and handhold you through the process of getting a Russia visa. For a single entry 6-month visa, which is the only visa Americans can get, the total cost is around $300 once you've received all of the information. But you do have to have an invitation letter from a Russian or from a Russian travel agency. However, these visa processors online can provide that letter to you at a cost usually between $30 and $70.
Okay. You really know you're in Moscow when what?
When you're standing in the middle of Red Square and you're looking up at the bright red star on top of the towers of the Kremlin, and you're looking at Saint Basil's cathedral, and you're seeing the cloudy gray skies overhead, and the snow is falling, and the domes on the top of the cathedral are covered in a thin dust of snow, and you turn around and you see one of those Russian women in their miniskirts and boots when it's 5 degrees below zero outside. That's when you know you're in Russia. I think you also know you're in Russia when you're flying on the plane to Moscow and they come around in the cabin and serve you chilled vodka.
And if you had to summarize Moscow in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Mysterious. Because I think it's Moscow and Russia in general, that region of the world is still very mysterious to a lot of people from North America, particularly from the United States. So definitely mysterious, ornate. Everything around Moscow is beautiful and ornate, and a lot of it was constructed during the Soviet times and during the Stalin era. So, of course, it's bigger and better than anything you'll ever see anywhere else in the world, and cold. Because my only experiences are going to Russia in the dead of winter when it's freezing cold.
I had heard that it's a Russian saying. Now I have a Russian coworker who tells me he hadn't heard it before, that life is hard, but it's short. But
Right. That's right.
John, thanks so much for coming on the show and telling us a little bit about your trips to Moscow.
Thank you, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
And I'd ask you where you're going next, but before we came on, you play a game with your friend. You do what to figure out sometimes where you're going to go?
I work for an airline, and one of the benefits, of course, of working for an airline is free and reduced airfare. So my friend and I like to go to the local airport, and we'll look up at the board, and we'll pick a gate, and we'll just go to wherever that destination is. But my next big trip is I'm going to Milan in a few weeks.
Excellent. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks again, Chris.
In the spot where I normally put internet resources, I've got both an internet resource, a news item, and a call for help. And that is that one good place to find good travel blogs and other good travel podcasts is the 2009 Lonely Planet Travel Blog Awards. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And one of the podcasts that has been nominated is The Amateur Traveler. I could really use your help. This is one that would be really good for the show if I could do well in this particular competition. And there's also a judging competition as well as a voting. You can only vote once, you could only vote once legally, and that's what I'm asking you to do. So if you could do that, I would appreciate that. And then you might also then check out all of the other travel blogs while you're there, because that will be a good source of information for you. And as long as you're in a voting mood, you may recall the Best Job in the World contest, where somebody gets $100,000 to live on a barrier reef island for 6 months from July till next December. Well, there were 35,000 different people who entered the contest, who entered a 1-minute video. One of the 50 finalists is a friend of mine and a fellow podcaster, Callie Lewis, from the Geek Brief TV show. So I'll put a link in the show notes also, so you can go and vote for Callie for that. Now, that's something you could vote every day if you wanted to, but check that out. And we recently had a contest which ended at the end of January at the Amateur Traveler, and I'd forgotten to announce the winners, and that was the Favorite City Contest. I had 4 entries for people who blogged about their favorite cities. Phil Yorko blogged about London, England, and Brett blogged about Boston, Massachusetts. Heather blogged about Bristol, and Darwin blogged about Singapore. So check out all of those entries, and I'll put links to them in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. With that and my voice failing from this cold I have, I think we'll draw this show to a close. Feel free to drop me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com. Leave a comment on this particular post at amateurtraveler.com, or follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/Chris2X. And as always, thanks so much for listening.